Sit on them to stop checking.
Hello, and welcome to Down the Rabbit Hole. Today we are going to be talking about some more of the father-in-law year's children. With that being said, we have made our way to Alexandra of Denmark. So we are on episode 194, and if you're new here, hit that like button, ring that bell for notifications. Also, please subscribe, help a girl out. I have condensed as much as I could, guys. I promise. But Princess Alexandra of Denmark was born into a relatively obscure line until 1852. Her father was chosen to would consent of major European powers to succeed her second cousin Frederick VII as king in Denmark. When she was 16, she was chosen to marry Albert Victor, um, who the Prince of Wales, who was the heir apparent to Queen Victoria, and they would marry 18 months later in 1863. That same year, her dad would become King of Denmark, and her brother William would be appointed King of Greece as George I. Now, she would be Princess of Wales from 1863 to 1901, and this was the longest anyone has ever held that title. And she became generally popular with her style and with that and even with it being copied, and she was excluded from any welding and any political power. She unsuccessfully attempted to sway her opinion with the British ministers and her husband's family to favor the Greek and Danish interest, and her public duties were restricted to controversial involvement in charity work. Upon the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, her husband would become King Edward VII, and she would become the Queen Consort, and she blamed the Queen Mother on her husband's death in 1910, at which their son George V would come to the throne, and that she would die at the age of 80 in 1925. So let's more let me know more about Princess Alexandra. Well, Princess Alexandra was born Alexandra Caroline Maria Charlotte Louise Julia. Her immediate family will call her Alex. She was born at the Yellow Palace, and her father was Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg, and Glosberg. Her mom was Princess Louise of Hesse and Kassel. She had five siblings: Frederick, William, Dagmar, Dira, and Voldemort. Now, her father was from a junior branch of the Danish royal house of Oldenburg, and he did live a comparatively modest life. They did not have that great. They did not have great wealth, and her father had become has an income from an army commission. Now, it was also occasionally Hans Christian Andersen would be invited to call and tell the children stories before bedtime. So, in 1848, Christian VIII of Denmark would die, and his only son Frederick would take the throne. However, Frederick was childless, and after two unsuccessful marriages, it was believed that he was infertile. Now, following a succession crisis, um, Alexandra's dad would become the heir apparent. Um, and Alexandra would share a room in the attic with Dogmore and her sister, um, Dira Brainfort. And they was and she made her own clothes and waited ready the table along with her sisters. Now, Alexandra and Dogmore were given swimming lessons by Nancy Edberg. And at Bernstorff, she grew into a young woman and was taught English. And she was devout through her life and followed a high church practice. Now let's talk about her marriage and her family now. Given that the Prince of Wales would reach the age of 20 in November 1861, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert would have taken steps to find a bride for him, and so they would enlist the help of their eldest daughter, Crown Victoria of Prussia. And looking into the suitable candidate, she was not only the first choice due to the Danes were loggerheads, but with the Prussians over the Schleswig Holsteins, but most of the British royal family were German, and she was eventually chosen as after they rejected all other possibilities. Now, on September 24th, 1861, Crown Princess Victoria would introduce Albert to Alexandra at the Spire, and almost a year later, on September 9th, 1862, he would propose. Now, this, of course, was after his affair with Nellie Clifton and the death of his father, Prince Albert. A few months later, he would travel from Denmark to Britain. She would travel from Denmark to Britain aboard a royal yacht. Victoria and Albert would arrive March 7, 1863. Then now and then Alexandra and Albert would be married March 10th, 1863. The dates were dismayed because of Alexandra's closest relations were only invited. And the British court was still in mourning, and ladies were restricted to wearing grey lilac or mauve. And they would leave Windsor for their honeymoon on the Isle of Wight. By the end of the following year, her father would have taken the throne. Her brother would have become king of Greece. Her sister would get engaged to the Tsarevich of Russia. And she would give birth to her first child. A lot happening, right? Well, her father's ascension would give rise to a further conflict of the fate of the Schleswig-Holstein, and the German Confederation invaded Denmark, reducing the area of Denmark by 2/5. And the great irritation of Queen Victoria and the Crown Princess of Prussia and Alexandra and Albert Edward supported the Danish side of the war, and the Prussians' conquest of the former Danish lands heightened Alexandra's profound dislike of the Germans, a feeling in which she stayed with her for the rest of her life. Now, her first child, Albert Victor, was born 2 months prematurely in 1864. Albert Edwards, and now Albert and Alexandra had 6 children in total, though. Albert Victor, George, Louise, Victoria, Maud, and Alexander. All of her children were apparently, quote, born prematurely, unquote. So it would throw Queen Victoria off, as well. Now, during the birth of her third child in 1867, there was a complication about the time, a rheumatic fever that threatened her life and left the baby with a permanent limp. In, in public, Alexandra was dignified and charming. In private, she was affectionate and jolly. And she was enjoying social scenes as well. Now, she also enjoyed hunting to the dismay of the queen, who wanted her to be more ladylike and all that. Even after the first of her birth of her first child, she continued to socialize much as she could, which led to some friction. Now, let's talk about her being Princess of Wales. So, Albert and Alexandra would visit Ireland in 1868. After her illness the previous year, she had only just began to walk without the aid of 2 walking sticks and was already pregnant with her fourth child. The royal couple undertook a 6 month tour of Austria, taking in Austria, Egypt, Greece, and over 1868 to 1869, which included visits to both her brother, George I of Greece, to the Crimean battlefields, for her only to the harem of the Khanif Ismail. In Turkey, she became the first woman to sit and have dinner with the Sultan. So, they would make the Sandringham House their preferred residence, with the Marlborough House in the London base. Um, and it was also state that Albert did not give his wife much attention as she would have liked, and they gradually became estranged until his attack of typhoid fever in the late 1871 and brought about reconciliation. Now, this was disputed by others who pointed out that Alexandra's frequent pregnancies throughout her period was used to family letters and existence rift. Now, nevertheless, the prince was severely criticized from many quarters of society for his apparent lack of interest in a very serious illness with rheumatic fever. Now, throughout their marriage, Albert continued to keep company with other women, including an actress, Lily Dandry, Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, humanitarian Agnes Kaiser, society matron Alice Keppel, and Alexandra knew about most of the relationships and later permitted Alice Keppel to visit her husband as he was dying. Now, an interesting fact is that a descendant of Alice Keppel is now the wife of the should be a princess consort, but she's the queen consort of the UK now. Yeah, but she would become increasingly, but over the years she would become deaf, causing her from his caused by hereditary osteosclerosis, and it led her to social isolation, and she would spend most of her time with her children and her pet. Her sixth and final pregnancy ended with the birth of a son, April 1871, but he would die the next day, and despite pleas from privacy, Queen Victoria would announce on announcing a period of court mourning, which led to unsympathetic elements of the press described the birth as a Welsh abortion, and the funeral arrangements as sickening mummery. Even though the infant was not buried in the state of the other members of the royal family in Windsor, but a strict privacy in the churchyard at Sandringham, where he had lived out his brief life. Now, for 8 months, the Prince of Wales was absent from Britain for a tour of India, but to the dismay of Alexandra, was left behind. Now, the prince had planned to spend much time hunting and shooting, and during the prince's tour, one of his friends who had traveled with him was told by his wife that she was going to leave him for another man, and Lord Blandford, who was married himself, um, was appalled and decided to seek a divorce. Meanwhile, Lord Blandford's brother, Lord Randolph Churchill, persuaded the lovers against an elopement, and now concerned the threat of divorce. And Lady Ellsworth would dissuade her from the proceeding, and was adamant and refused to consider any attempt to pressure them. Lord Ashburn would drop the divorce suit. So Lady Ashford and Lord Randolph Churchill called on Alexandra and told him that if the divorce was to proceed, that they would subpoena her husband as a witness and implicate him in the scandal. Now, distressed by their threats and the following advice of Sir William Coles and the Duchess of Teck, Alexandra informed the Queen, who who then wrote to the Prince of Wales, and the Prince insists eventually the Blandfords and the Ellsworth both separated privately, and although Lord Randolph Churchill later apologized for years afterwards, they refused to speak or see him. Now, Alexandra would spend the spring of 1877 in Greece, recuperating from a period of ill health and visiting her brother, King George of Greece. During the Russo-Turkish War, Alexandra was clearly partial. Was She was clearly partial to against Turkey and toward Russia, and where her sister was married to Zarvik, and she lobbied for a revision of the border between Greece and Turkey in favor of the Greeks. Alexandra spent the next 3 years largely parted from her two sons, as the boys were sent on a world-wide cruise as part of their naval and general education. The Pharaoh was very tearful and shown in regular letters that she missed him terribly. In 1881, Alexandra and Albert Edward would travel to St. Petersburg after the assassination of Alexander II of Russia, both to represent Britain and so that Alexandra could provide and comfort her sister, who had become a Tsarina. Now, Alexandra would undertake many public duties in the was the Queen Victoria. She also took a particular interest in the London hospital, which she would visit regularly. Joseph Merrick, the so-called Elephant Man, was one of the patients with whom she met, and crowds usually cheered for Alexandra rapturously. But during a visit into Ireland in 1885, she suffered a rare moment of public hostility, where she visited the city of Cork, a hotbed for Irish nationalism. Now, she and her husband were booed by a crowd of 2 or 3 thousand people with brandishing sticks and black flags. And she smiled her way through the ordeal, which the British press portrayed her as a positive light, describing the crowds as enthusiastic as part of the same visit. Now, she was saddened by the death of her oldest son, Prince Albert Victor, in 1892, and his room and possessions were kept exactly as he had left them. Much of those of his grandfather, Prince Albert, um, were left after his death in 1861. Now, surviving letters between Alexandra and her children indicate that she was mutually devoted. In 1894, Prince Alexander III of Russia died, and his nephew Nicholas II of Russia became Tsar. Alexandra's widowed sister, the Dowager Empress of Russia, leaned heavily on her for support. Alexandra, who had gone back to Russia accompanied by her husband, the Prince of Wales, slept, prayed, and stayed beside her sister for the next 2 weeks until her burial. Now, Alexandra and her husband on the wet stayed on for the wedding of Nicholas to their niece, Prince Alex of Hesse, in Bahrain, and who had taken the Russian name Alexandra Fyodorova, who had become the new Tsarina. And trust me, know the history between that, and that's very interesting. Now, with the death, let's talk about her being queen in the Empress Consort. Well, with the death of her mother-in-law, Queen Victoria, in 1901, Alexandra would become the Queen Empress, and with her husband, accession to Edward VII. Just 2 months later, her son, George, and daughter-in-law, Mary, were left for extensive tours of the empire, leaving their children and young children in the care of Alexandra and Edward, who doted on their grandchildren. On George's return, preparations for Edward and Alexandra's coronation in Westminster Abbey were well in hand. But just a few days before the scheduled coronation in June 1902, the king became seriously ill with appendicitis, and Alexandra deputized for him into a military parade to attend the royal ascot races without him, in an attempt to prevent public alarm. Eventually, the coronation had to be postponed, and Edward had an operation that was performed by Frederick Trees of the London Hospital to drain the infected appendix, and after his recovery, Alexandra and Edward were crowned together in August. Um, Now, despite being queen, her duties changed little, and she kept many of the same retainers. Her women of bedchambers, the Charlotte Knowles, whose daughter is Sir William Knowles, served as Alexandra's loyally for many years. On December 10th, 1903, she woke up to find the bedroom smoke, and she roused Alexandra and shepherded her for safety. In the words of Grand Duchess Augusta Mecklenburg-Strauss, we must give credit to Charlotte for saving Alexandra's life. Now, Alexandra again looked after her grandchildren when George and Mary went on a second tour, this time to British India over the winter of 1905. And her father, Christian IX of Denmark, died in January. Um, I forgot where I was. But Christian IX, Denmark, he would die in January. And eager to retain the family links both to each to each end in Denmark. In 1907, her and her sister, Dowager Empress of Russia, purchased a villa north of Copenhagen. Now, Alexandra was denied access to the king's briefing papers and was excluded from some of his foreign tours to prevent meddling in diplomatic matters. She was deeply distrustful for Germans, particularly for her nephew, German Emperor Wilhelm II, and she was invariably opposed anything that favored German expansion and interest. For example, in 1890, Alexandra wrote a memorandum distributed to British ministers and military personnel, warning against a planned exchange for the British North Sea of the Highlands, pointing out the heliostrategic significance that it can be used either by Germany to launch an attack or by Britain to contain Germanic aggression. Despite the exchange went ahead, um, and the Germans fortified the islands, and in the words of Robert Esner and Alexander had predicted, it became a keystone in Germany's maritime position for the offense of the offense as well as the defense. Now, Alexandra despised and distrusted Emperor Wilhelm, calling him inwardly our enemy. In 1910, she would be the first Queen Consort to visit the British House of Commons during a debate, in a remarkable departure for her 2 hours that she sat in the ladies' gallery overlooking the chamber. Now, privately, she disagreed with the bill. Shortly afterwards, she left her brother George in curfew, while she received the news that King Edward was seriously ill. Now, Alexandra returned at once and arrived the day before her husband died. In his last hours, she personally administered oxygen and gas cylinder to help him. Let's talk about her being a queen mother now. Um, from Edward's death, Alexandra was queen mother, being a dowager queen and the month's reigning monarch. She did not attend the coronation of her son and daughter-in-law in 1911, since it was customary for a crown queen to attend the coronation of another king, or not customary. Now, but otherwise, continued the public side of her life, devoting time to charitable causes. One such cause was Alexandra Rose Day, was artificial roses made by people with disabilities and sold them to hospitals by women volunteers. Now, during the First World War, the custom of hanging the banners of foreign princes invested with British highest order of knighthood in the Order of Garter in St. George's Chapel. On September 17, 1916, she was at Sandrium during a Zeppelin air raid, but far worse befell upon other members of her family. In Russia, um, her nephew, Tsar Nicholas II, was overthrown, and he and his wife and his children were killed by revolutionaries. Her sister, Dowager Empress, was rescued from Russia in 1919 by the HMS Marlborough and brought to England, where she lived with some time for Alexandra. Let's talk about the last years and her death. Now, she retained a youthful appearance into her senior years, but during the war, her age caught up with her, and she wore elaborate veils and cover of heavy makeup, which was described by gossips and having her face enameled. And she had no more trips abroad, and her health worsened. In 1920, a blood vessel in her eyebrows, leaving her with temporary partial blindness. Throughout the end of her life, her memory and her speech became impaired. She died November 20th, 1925, at the Sandringham House from a heart attack. And she was laid in state at Westminster Abbey and was interred November 28th next to her husband. Let's talk about her legacy now. The Queen Memorial, Alexandra Memorial by Alfred Gilbert, was unveiled on June 8, 1932, at the Marlborough Gate. Um, but yes. But that is it for this episode. You can join me next time as we talk about the era of Denmark. Um, I hope y'all have a great day and a happy Thanksgiving.